Hi, everyone. Welcome to WOTS Weekly Features. Today's guest is Adam Bunch, author and creator of the Toronto Dreams Project. We'll be chatting with Adam about his book, The Toronto Book of Love, the creative process behind exploring history through storytelling, and much more. I'm Yeli, and I'll be your host. WOTS Toronto operates on land that is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg and Allied Nations to care for and to share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land that you live on wherever you're tuning in from. Now on to our guest. Adam Bunch is an award-winning storyteller who brings the history of Toronto and Canada to life. He's the author of the Toronto Book of the Dead and the Toronto Book of Love, the host of the Canadiana documentary series, and the creator of the Toronto Dreams Project. He's taught history at George Brown College and created writing workshops for the Toronto Public Library. He's spoken at the Art Gallery of Ontario and the Royal Ontario Museum, and his writing has appeared in publications such as Spacing Magazine and the Huffington Post. His work popularizing Canadian history was recognized with an honorable mention for a Governor General's Award in 2012. Thank you so much for joining us today, Adam. It's a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Could you start off by telling us a little bit about the inspiration behind the Toronto Book of Love?
So I've been writing about the history of the city for a while now, I guess about 10 years, a little bit more than that, and getting more and more into it. And I started with a project originally that was a fiction project, kind of a strange one where I would write, that's the Toronto Dreams Project, where I'd write these fictional sort of little dream-like short stories about people from the city's history, and then print them on little postcards with a design on one side and leave them around the city for people to find in public places that were related to that person's true history, which I always thought of as a way to try to bring those stories to life a little bit. And Toronto's really earned its reputation as a city. I think that it hasn't always taken its history very seriously. We're done a good job of preserving that built heritage or telling the stories of the people who, over the last hundreds of years and even long before the city was founded, contributed to make the city that we live in today. And I hear often that that's because it's so often taught in a very dry way. And it's hard, I think, sometimes to remember that those people who came here before us were all actual, real, live, breathing human beings, not just names in a textbook or lists of dates and events. They're people who had, feelings and passions and rivalries and torrid love affairs. And the more you start digging into the history of the city, the more those stories start popping up. So I've been writing about them, the true stories to go along with those little fictional ones, because each card has a URL on it, so that if you find it, you can look up that card online and find a link to the true story. So for years and years, I've been writing some of those true stories, and eventually had enough that I thought I'd learned enough and had some stories in the bag that I could put together in a book, which was my first book, the Toronto Book of the Dead, that tries to tell sort of the whole history of the city through stories that are related to death and dying. So everything from duels and murders to seances, all
So cool.
Overview of the history of the city and helping hopefully to bring some of those dead Torontonians back to life a little bit. And that theme of death was one that kind of let me talk about whatever I wanted to, because every story ends the same way. Everyone's got the death story as part of their historical story. So having a big, broad theme like that let me kind of tell that bigger story of Toronto, because I could pick out different moments from the city's past and tell stories that let me tell that bigger story because there's so many of them. And as the follow-up to that, I was looking for a similar kind of theme, something that's universal, that so many people have a great love story. And we know it from our own lives, that those stories get sort of handed down within families, and those heirlooms, whether it's your grandmother's wedding ring or just the story of how your parents met or your own dating history and your first kiss and your first date. And I like the idea that a city has those too, that we have collectively as a community a romantic history that gets passed down and has these stories of those love affairs and heartbreaks and divorces and first kisses that all give you a sense of the city itself. That in telling a bunch of individual love stories, you can tell the whole history of Toronto, its development as a city and how it became the place it is today. And I think another interesting story, which is the story of the city's attitude towards love and how that's changed over the centuries too. So it's another, sort of a cheating theme that lets me talk about so many different things, and hopefully in a way that's engaging and entertaining, so people are learning about their city while also hopefully being surprised by how interesting and fascinating and engaging it really is.
Awesome. Yes. I just think that the theme of death and the theme of love just go pair together so well as little companions to each other.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you kind of made the shift towards these short stories to more nonfiction. So within that, could you tell us a little bit about what the research process looked like behind uncovering these now true stories that you're writing about?
For this book especially, it was a lot of online and library searches. This book was a bit more challenging than the first book. So usually it's just a combination of everything and just a lot of reading and digging and sort of keeping my eye out for any stories that feel like they might fit. And then when I find one, start digging into reading everything I can about it. But this book, the sort of second half of it was all written after the lockdown started.
Oh, wow.
Unexpectedly stopped being able to go to the library and, spend a day at the reference library digging into their more obscure books or into the archives, getting to read the, primary source documents like I would have otherwise. So that last day before we all went into lockdown, I was running around libraries grabbing books I can get my hands on, and some friends went to the branches I couldn't reach and sort of loaded up on as many books as I could, and then got some more from the library over the rest of the year, and got as many historical source documents as I possibly could online. But it was definitely a challenge, and there were places where it was a bit of a shame. There's a chapter in the book about Robert Baldwin, who's one of the big, most influential politicians in Canadian history. He was the big champion for democracy and brought responsible government about. And he's in the Book of the Dead and the Book of Love because he has a crazy love story. He was deeply, wildly in love with his wife, Eliza, who died when they were both still pretty young. So for the rest of his life, Robert Baldwin was deep in mourning for Eliza. And during all these battles over the future of Canadian democracy, which were pretty violent, exciting, responsible government sounds like such a dry idea, but it involved dualism, burning people in effigy and riots. And the day it became a reality, the Tories burned the Parliament buildings to the ground in Montreal. And the whole time he was fighting all those really quite dangerous battles, Baldwin was suffering from severe depression, plagued by nightmares and falling asleep in Parliament. Every year on his wedding anniversary, you could find him wandering the streets of Toronto, from St. James Cathedral, where they'd gotten married, visiting all the landmarks of their relationship, all the way up to Spadina House, where they had lived for a while when they were married. But he's also got the story of his best friend growing up, James Hunter Sampson, seems from his letters to have been in love with Robert Baldwin himself. And has these letters where he professes his love for him and says, there's no woman who could ever love you more than I do. And Baldwin fell in love with Eliza instead. And James Hunter Sampson went on to become a pretty hard-drinking and curmudgeonly hardcore Tory on the opposite side of the political divide from his beloved Robert. And those letters where he professes his love and they talk about poetry and romance and all that stuff are in the reference library where I couldn't get at them, which was deeply frustrating not to be able to see anything that I couldn't find from somebody else. And thankfully, there's so many wonderful books and wonderful writers and historians and archivists who've been sharing these stories for ages before I came along. So you can get snippets and quotes from the letters by reading everybody else's stuff, but it did make this book's research process a lot more challenging than the typical having to do it during this particular time in history.
Yes, I love that you mentioned that story as well, because it's definitely something that likely wouldn't be in a history textbook, like you mentioned, all of those feelings and love in that way.
Yeah, and the climax to the story, too, is that Baldwin was sort of longing for death. And when he finally did get responsible government, he retired and sort of went downhill pretty quickly. When he died, he was buried in the family tomb at Spadina House. It's now in St. James Cemetery in Cabbagetown. They moved it. But a couple of weeks, I think, after he'd been laid to rest, his family found a note in one of his jacket pockets that laid out his last requests, most of which were pretty normal. Things like he wanted to be buried with the love letters that they'd sent to each other that he'd always kept in his pocket. For the rest of his life, and a locket that she'd given him as a gift. But there were bizarre ones too, like he asked to be have his coffin chained to hers, so guaranteed to be together for eternity. And weirdest of all, he said he wanted his corpse to be given the same kind of cesarean section wound that had killed her. And he was very clear in his note that he wanted this to be carried out even if he'd already been laid to rest. So weeks after they buried him the first time, some of his family members had to descend back down into the tomb with the doctor and crack his coffin open and split his corpse with a scalpel and then close him back together and chain him to Eliza. So they're still presumably in the tomb together, beneath the surface of Cabbagetown, the bones of this father of Canadian democracy chained to the bones of the woman he loved. And it is the crazy story and the kind of thing that, like I didn't know that until years ago, reading other stuff about Baldwin, and not the kind of stuff that gets shared a lot. But I think the kind of story that hopefully gets people more interested to learn more about the people in them and what they did and how they contributed to make the city and the country what they are today, for the good and the bad.
Yes, wet and intense love.
Pretty hardcore romantic to a fault, I think.
Yes. Do you have a favorite memory from the research process, or like a favorite story that you've uncovered?
I'm a big fan of the chapter I wrote about Sir Sandford Fleming, who's another one of those guys you might learn about in class because he was a big, probably Canadian history's most famous engineer. He engineered, he was working on the railroad as they were building it across Canada, and worked as, I think, the chief engineer on Toronto's first railway in the 1850s, and is the guy who really championed the idea of time zones and convinced the rest of the world to adopt it. So pretty fundamental stuff, but also a little bit dry, railroads and time zones and stuff. But he was a bit of a player himself. And I found a story, I was reading a book about him in the reference library one day that had excerpts from his diary. And I noticed something that, as far as I know, no one else had caught before, which is a story of a summer when he was in his 20s and starting to think about settling down. And he'd been dating a woman whose name currently escapes me. Usually I know it. But going on long romantic walks through the city and like up to Yorkville, which was its own picturesque village north of the city back then, up Yonge Street. They'd been spending enough time together courting that it was clear that it was time to make a decision about whether they had a future together, whether they should get married, or whether this wasn't the woman for him. And Sanford Fleming, this very scientific, analytical, engineering mind, still seems to have believed pretty strongly in fate and omens. So he decided, and maybe less in personal responsibility, because he decided to leave the decision up to fate. And he took her on another walk up to Yorkville and laid out his plan, which was that 2 weeks from that date, they would wait and see what the sunset was like. And if it was a bright, clear day with a glorious pink sunset, they would get married and spend the rest of their lives together. But if it were a dreary, overcast day like today, without a real sunset at all, then they would break up.
Oh
and
my gosh.
Is that there was no sunset, and he dumped her, and she was furious and returned all his love letters and broke off all contact. He had to go explain himself to her parents after it all went down, but thought it was for the best, and probably was, because he clearly wasn't into dedicate his life to her. And then just about a month later, an old family friend of his from Peterborough came and visited over the holidays. And they started spending a lot of time together. And he was accompanying her back to Peterborough, riding on a sleigh through the countryside, maybe going a little too fast, because I hit a tree stump in the road and got thrown out of the sleigh. Sanford Fleming hit his head pretty hard and got knocked unconscious. And we came to his old friend Jeannie was hovering over him, worried about his health, and helped lead him to a nearby doctor's house where she helped nurse him back to health over the course of the next week. And they fell deeply in love. And as soon as he got back into Toronto, he sent a letter off to her to propose. And she said yes in the next post back to Toronto. And they got married almost a year to the day later. And on their honeymoon went to the doctor's house where they had fallen in love. And Sanford Fleming noticed they were passing that same old fateful tree stump that had sort of thrown them together, literally, and got out and was hacking away at it. And Jeannie was teasing him about it because it was taking a while and saying, why, like, what are you even going to use that for? He said he wasn't sure, but he was sure he'd find some use for it someday. And he did eventually, after they'd had children and they had a big family and grandchildren and everything. He used it, that wood from that stump, turned it into a picture frame for a photo of their children, which would have been an especially precious artifact back then when photography was so new and so rare. So he's a bit of that fate in the way he ended up meeting or falling in love with his eventual love of his life too. And they stayed together for the rest of their lives, very happily. So unfortunate for the one who got dumped, worked out well for him and his wife in the end. And stumbling across that story was a very good day of realizing how much there was to it and the craziness of the sunset from someone who was so scientifically minded doing something so unscientific.
Yes. It's also so nice to think that even back then people were having summer roses and all of those loving affairs like that.
There's like these dry characters in textbooks so often, but they were way more like us in a lot of ways than I think we tend to think. There was a different time with a lot of differences, but they were all falling in love and cheating on each other and breaking hearts and lusting after each other. Just plenty, even though it was such a different time.
Yes. Could you talk a little bit about what draws you to history as a genre, just in general? why are you drawn to writing about the past rather than stories that are set in the present and things that are moving currently?
Oh, it's a very big question. Like the most basic answer is that history is basically just everything that's ever happened. So it's such a big topic, history in general, that it really means you get to write about anything at all. And there's so much to choose from. And if you're someone who wants a lot of variety and to be able to look into whatever happens to be interesting you at a given moment, then history is a pretty good place to start. And as someone who's lived in Toronto for basically my whole life, getting to learn more about this place and how it's ended up this way, where our flaws come from. Some of those people who made the city a worse place to live, who we're talking about a lot more these days, people like the Jarvises and the Dennisons, whose names are on streets around us, but who people didn't really consciously realize until recently are slaveholders and racists and architects of genocidal residential school systems, all the way to the people who made positive contributions and fought back against figures like that. Someone like Marianne Shadd, who's the first Black woman in North America to be publishing her own newspaper. All those stories, all those people built the city and the country that we live in. So I think learning about history isn't even removed from writing about what's happening now or understanding what's happening now and contributing to try to make things better, because I think it is, as I think we're realizing more and more right now, that it's deeply important to understand the past in order to understand how things got this way, how people were able to make positive change, like how the good things that we have aren't just luck or a coincidence that are just handed down from posterity. They were things that in most cases were hard won and hard fought battles over what the future of the country would look like in the city. And we are obviously very much going through a moment like that right now. So I think understanding those stories from the past helps arm you for what's happening now and helps you understand how things can be made better, the ways other people have made them better in the past, and what's wrong with them and how they got to be this way, and what ways they might need to be fixed.
For sure, absolutely. Are there any stories or any events that you're interested in writing about in the future that you haven't been able to dip your toes into yet?
Oh, there's so many all the time. Just a ton. Things coming up. I think my next book might be about the history of baseball, because I'm a big baseball fan. It's been a while since there's a history of Toronto baseball, so I'm really excited to learn more about that as I start writing it. And I imagine too there are a lot of stories I'd like to learn more about the way Toronto relates to other cities. Torontonians go other places, and people from other places come here and have all those, same number of fascinating stories about what they get up to. But I think I've taken the Dreams project on the road a few times and left dreams first across the UK and England and Wales, in places that are related to Toronto history over there. And I've done it across Europe too, and in New York City. And each time I start thinking a lot about how stories tend to fall through the cracks that geography creates. So when you go to England looking for Toronto history, it's just all around you all the time. Especially England has such a deep tie to Toronto's colonial roots and how it all got started with the founding of the city and the Simcoes and stuff. But the stories that happened over there, we don't tend to talk about, even less than we talk about any of our Toronto historical stories. But especially the ones that didn't physically happen within the city. But there are stories that had a huge impact on us that happened over there with Torontonians. And people over there aren't telling them either, because they're about Toronto, and that's not something they particularly care about necessarily. So I'm interested in digging more into those stories that are how Toronto connects to the rest of the world, and some of those stories that might fall through the cracks, because the ones I found so far have been fascinating. And Toronto is such an international city with so many people from everywhere else that I think there's probably a lot to learn about the way this city in particular relates to the rest of the world and the connections we have to other places.
For sure. Besides the Toronto Book of the Dead, are there any other recommendations that you have for someone who's looking to learn more about some historical reads?
Oh, there's so many about Toronto in particular. There's some great ones. And since my books tell, each chapter is a different story, and they're often really wonderful books that dive really deeply into one of those topics that I only get to touch on very briefly. So some of the ones I've been thinking about a lot recently are it's a wonderful book edited by John Lorink and others about the history of the Ward, which is a neighborhood people are starting to learn more about right now, which is sort of a collection of essays about it. Which was a neighborhood that got a reputation as being Toronto's most notorious slum, and then just got bulldozed when it was Chinatown to make room for Nathan Phillips Square, and has a wealth of stories. There's a similar book it's a collection of essays about Toronto's LGBTQ plus history, Any Other Way, which came out just in time for the research for the Book of Love. And was an absolutely vital and wonderful resource to be able to draw on, and is full of really powerful, interesting, entertaining stories about that history and so much of the history of love in Toronto. And I'm really excited now that the book's done, and I've been working away on scripts for the new season of my documentary series, Canadiana, which we're about to go film. And as soon as I'm done writing that, and right now all my reading has to be research for that, but I'm very excited to dig into some books that I haven't been able to read yet that have come out sort of since I started working on the Book of Love, like Katie Dobbs' Missing Millionaire, which tells another one of the most exciting stories in Toronto history, a huge mystery of Ambrose Small, who is this millionaire theater mogul who just disappeared one day right after checking, I think it was the biggest check in Canadian history, maybe $1 million if I'm remembering right. And then the next day disappears off the face of the earth, and no one's ever been able to find any trace of what happened to him. So I'm excited to read that. And the Indigenous Toronto book that just came out, which is another collection of stories about Toronto's Indigenous past and present that I'm very excited to dig into too.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Who doesn't love a good mystery, right? Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was I enjoy talking about this stuff. This was a great pleasure. Thanks.
Amazing. All right, everyone, to check out more from Dundurn Press and get your copy of the Toronto Book of Love, go to dundurn.com. To learn more about Adam and support all of his work, go to adambunch.com. This has been today's WOTS Weekly Feature. Tune in next week for Sci-Fi Fantasy Week. For discounts and deals, check out toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca/weekly-features. From all of us at WOTS, happy reading.